All across the Americas, from the Mississippi Valley all the way down to the jungles of the Yucatan, you can find these silent monuments of forgotten worlds. We're talking massive pyramids, sprawling cities, colossal earthworks that just whisper of these incredible civilizations lost to time. But you know what? These aren't just archaeological sites. They are the center of a battle that's been raging for centuries over one single powerful question. Who really owns the past?
Okay, let's really dive into this. I want you to picture it. It's the late 19th century. American settlers are moving west, and they start stumbling upon things that just don't make any sense to them. I'm not talking about small burial mounds. I'm talking about entire cities made of earth, like Cahokia, with pyramids that soar 100 feet into the air. Sanctuaries where, from miles away, you could see the smoke and flames of their rituals. These were not primitive campsites, not by a long shot. These were the ruins of a metropolis.
So, of course, this discovery immediately sparked this intense, and I mean intense, debate. Who were these master architects? Who could have possibly built something on this scale? The answer seemed obvious to some people, but to others, it was just impossible. And that single question, it would ignite a battle for the very soul of American history.
All right, so to really get a grip on this whole conflict, we've got to go back to that first moment of encounter. This is where you have two totally different worldviews just colliding right on top of these ancient mounds. And in doing so, they created a literal battleground for history itself.
For a lot of the settlers pushing west, the answer to that question was a hard no. They would look at the Native American tribes they were encountering, many of whom were nomadic or had been violently displaced from their lands, and they just couldn't square that with the kind of sophisticated, settled civilization that must have built these cities. So this created a kind of historical vacuum, a mystery that, in their minds, needed an explanation.
And you know what happens when there's a vacuum? Something rushes in to fill it. In this case, it was a powerful and, frankly, very convenient idea: the myth of a lost, vanished race of mound builders. The whole theory basically went like this. Some other sophisticated, non-Indian civilization built these amazing mounds and then just disappeared, leaving the land open for new settlers. Convenient, right? And what's so fascinating here is you can see two completely different ways of thinking clashing. On one hand, you have the 19th century theory, which imagines this mysterious, advanced civilization that was totally separate from and, superior to modern Native Americans. But then modern archaeology comes along and points in the complete opposite direction. It says, no, the key is the environment. These cultures were deeply, deeply connected to their surroundings and were absolutely part of a long, continuous line of native peoples.
Now, to back up their theory, the lost race proponents pointed to what they saw as compelling evidence. They'd say, look how old and dilapidated these mounds are. They must be ancient. And the burials, with these complex vaults and urns, they just seemed too different. They found finely woven fabrics, copper objects, things they didn't associate with local tribes. And they drew this really sharp line between building with earth, which they saw as the work of a settled civilization, and the timber palisades used by some later Native American groups. But here's the thing. While all this debate about a lost race was raging in North America, archaeologists digging further south were uncovering a completely different story. A story of undeniable, spectacular indigenous grandeur. Just look at this timeline for a second. This isn't a story about one single lost race. This is a breathtaking epic of one empire after another spanning 3,000 years. You've got the Olmecs developing complex writing systems, the rise of the incredible city of Teotihuacan, the flourishing of the great Maya city-states, and finally, the founding of the massive Aztec capital. This was a world of deep, continuous, powerful civilization. And this number, this just perfectly illustrates the scale we're talking about. 200,000 people. In the year 500 CE, Teotihuacan wasn't just some big city in the Americas. It was one of the largest cities on the entire planet, a global center of population, culture, and power. So the whole idea that indigenous peoples were somehow incapable of building great civilizations, it just completely falls apart when you look at this. And these societies, they were built on these incredibly complex belief systems. I mean, take the concept of auto-sacrifice. This wasn't just random violence. It was a core religious idea based on reciprocity. The thinking was the gods shed their own blood to create humanity, so humans owed a blood debt in return. It shows this profound philosophical and religious life that was the engine of these empires. So, okay, the evidence for massive, sophisticated, indigenous empires is just overwhelming, right? It totally challenges that old lost race theory. But what happens when new movements come along that don't just want to reinterpret the past, but want to completely rewrite the entire narrative of who was here first? So now, fast forward to the early 20th century. You have Black nationalist leaders like the incredible Marcus Garvey, who argued that history as it was being taught was, in itself, a tool of oppression. For Garvey, the path to liberation wasn't about trying to find a place in the existing story. It was about rejecting that story entirely and creating a new one, centered on African origins and racial redemption. And that thinking eventually evolved into what we now call Afrocentrism. The core idea here is that to understand any world history, including the history of the Americas, you have to start with the global migrations of African peoples. It completely reframes the whole story of human settlement. It proposes that Black people were the original world explorers who populated the entire globe, long before any migrations happened across the Bering Strait.
So this is really the crucial point. This sets up two fundamentally different origin stories for the Americas. On one side, you have the mainstream scientific consensus, which, based on a ton of archaeological and genetic evidence, points to migration from Asia across the Bering Strait. But on the other side, the Afrocentric perspective challenges that head-on. It argues that the first Americans were part of that foundational global migration out of Africa, and that they arrived way earlier and by different means, maybe even by sea. This isn't just tweaking the timeline, it's a completely different claim on who the original people of this continent actually were.
Okay, so we've got the lost race theory, indigenous history, Black nationalism, Afrocentrism. I know, it's a lot to juggle, but this is the moment where it all comes together. Because the battle, you see, it isn't just about dusty old facts. It's about what those facts mean for every single one of us, right here, today. And this is the pivot. This is the shift in thinking we need to make. Instead of getting bogged down asking, okay, but who's right? Let's ask a different and, I think, much more powerful question. Why is this story even being told in the first place? Because every single one of these historical narratives serves a purpose in the present. This table really just lays it all out beautifully. Think about it. The lost race theory. It made it way easier to justify displacing Native Americans because, well, they didn't build this stuff anyway. For Black nationalists, rejecting a hostile, oppressive narrative was a vital step towards psychological freedom and building group unity. Afrocentrism, it directly confronts a Eurocentric worldview to build up racial pride. And for Native peoples, proving their direct line of ancestry to the mound builders is a crucial act of reclaiming their heritage, their history, and their land rights. And this link between the past and the present, it is so incredibly powerful and alive. It's not just theory. Look at this quote about Native American soldiers in World War I. They weren't just fighting for America. For many, they were consciously fighting to renew their own historical identity as warriors. History wasn't some dusty old book on a shelf. It was an active source of strength, a guide for how to act in the modern world. So really, the ultimate takeaway here is this. The stories we tell about the past are the very tools we use to build our present and to imagine our future. They shape our identity, they shape our politics, and they shape our sense of place in the entire world. Which brings us to the final question, the one I want to leave with you. What purpose does your history serve? What story does it tell about you?